The courtroom was silent when the gavel struck. A single, sharp sound cut through the thick air, echoing across the marble walls. The audience, composed of reporters, legal scholars, and government officials, fell quiet. At the center, the emblem of the Supreme Court loomed high above, glimmering beneath the morning light filtering through the tall windows. Chief Justice John Roberts sat poised behind the bench, calm, deliberate, his expression unreadable. Before him stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her posture straight, her eyes fierce and determined. The air between them was electric, the kind of charged silence that precedes confrontation. The clerk's voice trembled slightly as he read the matter before the court. This was no ordinary hearing. It was a constitutional inquiry, one that questioned the boundaries of judicial authority and legislative oversight. When the formalities ended, Roberts spoke first. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said evenly, "this court convenes not to revisit political grievances, but to examine the constitutional parameters of power. I trust that your arguments will adhere to the rule of law." Crockett's reply was measured, but the sharpness of her tone revealed the storm behind her words. "With respect, Chief Justice, the rule of law is precisely why we're here. For too long, the interpretation of justice has been filtered through lenses tinted by privilege and protection. My purpose today is simple: to remind this chamber that justice, when shielded from accountability, ceases to be justice at all." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Roberts leaned slightly forward, fingers steepled. "Accountability," he repeated softly, "is the cornerstone of democracy. Yet one must ask, accountability to whom? To public sentiment, or to the Constitution that guides us?" Crockett didn't flinch. "To both. The Constitution is not a museum piece, sealed behind glass. It was written for people, for the living, not the privileged few who twist its intent to serve power." Her voice grew steadier with each word. "We sit here because the judiciary has been used as a shield to protect those in power from the consequences of their actions. That's not constitutional interpretation, that's complicity." The Chief Justice adjusted his spectacles, the faintest trace of unease flickering behind his composed demeanor. "Congresswoman, you imply corruption where there is none. The judiciary's independence is vital. It exists to protect the Constitution from the tides of politics. You, as a member of Congress, surely understand the danger of undermining that independence." "Independence," Crockett's voice rose slightly, "or insulation, there's a difference. When the court interprets the law in ways that silence accountability, when rulings disproportionately shield those already powerful, we must question whether independence has morphed into impunity." Roberts straightened. "This institution has no allegiance but to the law." "Then perhaps the law needs to look in the mirror," she countered. "Because if your rulings allow one group to silence another, if they suppress voices calling for justice, then this court has become the very instrument of oppression it was meant to guard against." The exchange was precise, controlled, a duel of intellect, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. The reporters scribbled frantically. Even the court guards shifted uneasily. Roberts broke the silence again. "Congresswoman Crockett, your rhetoric is impassioned, but law is not passion. It cannot bend to outrage, no matter how righteous it may seem. The Constitution's integrity depends on restraint, not revolution." Crockett's expression softened, but her words were sharper still. "Restraint, Chief Justice, has been the refuge of those who fear change. The founders didn't build this nation on restraint. They built it on defiance, defiance of tyranny, of silence, of notion that authority must never be questioned." She took a step forward, her voice steady now. "You call my words passionate. I call them necessary, because every time a citizen sees injustice upheld by those sworn to prevent it, faith in the law erodes, and when faith dies, so does democracy." Robert's tone cooled further, a warning beneath the calm. You walk a dangerous line, Congresswoman. To suggest that this court acts unjustly is to undermine public confidence in the judicial branch. Her reply came without hesitation. No, Chief Justice. What undermines confidence is when truth is silenced, when this chamber becomes a place where facts are filtered by power. My role isn't to comfort this court's reputation. It's to speak for those who can't stand here themselves. A hush fell over the room again. Roberts exhaled quietly, his patience thinning. He adjusted the papers before him. And who, precisely, do you claim to represent in this matter? Crockett's answer carried no hesitation. Every citizen who's been told to wait for justice that never comes. Every whistleblower threatened into silence. Every worker dismissed when they stood up to corruption. This courtroom may bear the symbol of balance, but too often that balance tips in favor of those who already hold the scales. The Chief Justice's jaw tightened. You tread dangerously close to contempt. Crockett's eyes didn't waver. Contempt, Chief Justice, is pretending that silence equals respect. I came here to tell the truth, not to protect comfort. A few gasps echoed across the gallery. Robert's gavel struck sharply once. This is not a stage for political theater. She met his gaze directly, then stopped, turning justice into one. For a brief, suspended moment, the courtroom seemed frozen. Roberts stared at her, and she at him, neither yielding. The marble floor, the flag overhead, the silence of centuries of precedent, all seemed to press down on the moment. Finally, Roberts spoke again, this time more measured. Congresswoman Crockett, the court will grant you time to present evidence in support of your claims. Until then, I suggest you remember the decorum this chamber demands. Her reply was quiet but unyielding. Decorum is earned by integrity, not demanded by power. The Chief Justice's gaze lingered, cold and calculating. Proceed with your opening argument. Crockett nodded, gladly. She took a breath, turning toward the assembled bench. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, history has shown that the truth does not always find a seat at this table. From segregation rulings to surveillance justifications, from political cover up selective justice, the pattern has been consistent. Power protects itself. I'm here to break that pattern. Her words landed heavy in the air, each one echoing off the high ceiling like a declaration. We have come to believe that justice is blind, but too often it simply turns its head. The Chief Justice listened, his face a mask of control, though something behind his eyes flickered, not anger, but something closer to reflection. Crockett continued, unflinching. This isn't about party or position. It's about principle. When the courts forget who they serve, when rulings silence the people instead of defending them, we no longer have justice. We have authority without accountability. The Chief Justice spoke softly this time, but the weight of his words filled the room. Congresswoman, if your argument is that this court has failed the people, then you must be prepared to prove it. Her response was simple. I am. The clock on the far wall ticked once, twice, before the sound of pens resumed, scribbling history in real time. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the marble dome, and inside, the first fault lines of confrontation began to form. The courtroom reconvened after a brief recess. The heavy wooden doors shut behind the returning crowd, muffling the murmurs of speculation that had swelled in the corridors. Cameras had been barred from the chamber, but the tension inside could have been captured without a lens. The shifting postures, the fixed stares, the air so taut it could split. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium again, a thick folder of documents before her. Chief Justice Roberts observed in silence, the faint rhythm of his pen tapping against the desk betraying his patience. The other justices leaned forward, some curious, others cautious. Crockett began. Your Honor, I've brought evidence not of a single act, but of a pattern. a pattern that shows how judicial discretion has been used to protect the powerful while punishing those who seek accountability. She lifted a document. Case number 14-387, Whistleblower Protection. The lower courts ruled in favor of an individual exposing corporate fraud. This bench overturned it on a technicality, citing lack of jurisdiction. Months later, the same corporation donated millions to a political action group advocating for judicial restraint. Coincidence? Her tone was restrained, but the implication struck like a hammer. Roberts replied, his tone precise, almost surgical. Congresswoman, the judiciary cannot be held responsible for the actions of private entities outside its purview. We interpret the law as it stands. The motives of others are not within our jurisdiction. Crockett met his gaze. But your rulings influence those motives. When this court signals that accountability can be dodged through technical language, it sends a message. Power can buy protection, as long as it hides behind procedure. Roberts interlaced his fingers. Procedure is the foundation of fairness. Without it, we descend into chaos, where passion dictates justice instead of principle. Crockett's voice softened, but her words cut deeper. Chief Justice, fairness isn't measured by how well the powerful sleep at night. It's measured by how much faith the powerless still have in the system. Tell me, how much faith do you think they have left? A long pause. The gallery remained still. Roberts finally spoke, his voice low. Faith cannot be restored by accusation. It is restored by discipline, by adherence to the rule of law, not the rule of emotion. And yet, Crockett said, stepping closer to the bench, when the law becomes so tangled in procedure that truth suffocates beneath it, whose discipline are we preserving, the people's or the system's? The Chief Justice's reply came crisp. The law is the system. Undermine one, and you erode the other. She didn't yield. Then maybe the system needs rebuilding, not protection. A faint stir passed through the audience, whispers quickly shushed by the bailiff. Roberts leaned forward. Congresswoman Crockett, you speak as though this court acts in secrecy, as though we are blind to the consequences of our decisions. Yet every ruling we deliver is bound by precedent, by centuries of jurisprudence designed to maintain order. Crockett's brow furrowed. Order without justice is simply control. Precedent without conscience is preservation of error. The line hung in the air like a verdict of its own. Even some of the attending clerks glanced up from their notes. Roberts adjusted his robe slightly, a controlled motion masking frustration. You seek reform through confrontation. That may earn applause in Congress or on television, but it risks undermining the very structure that ensures stability in this nation. Crockett's tone remained calm. Stability for whom? For those insulated by the system, or for those crushed beneath it? Because if the former, then stability is just another word for silence. Roberts countered quickly, and chaos, Congresswoman, is what follows when every institution is accused of corruption without proof. Proof, she said sharply. Proof lies in outcomes. When citizens protest injustice and find themselves dismissed by rulings that protect the status quo, that is proof. When the bench ignores the imbalance of power while citing neutrality, that is proof. Neutrality in the face of inequality is not justice, it's endorsement. The Chief Justice's eyes narrowed slightly. His tone hardened. You presume to lecture this court on neutrality, yet you stand here as a politician and advocate by nature. Your argument risks turning the judiciary into an extension of politics, precisely what the Constitution sought to prevent. Crockett's reply was steady, her words deliberate. Politics and justice may inhabit separate chambers, Chief Justice, but their walls are thin. Decisions made here echo through the halls of Congress, through the streets, through every home where people wonder whether their voices matter. If you believe justice exists apart from the people it serves, then it has already failed. The room was silent again, the kind of silence that forces reflection. Roberts sighed softly, leaning back. "You are persuasive, Congresswoman, but persuasion is not proof, and passion is not law. Our role demands restraint because emotion clouds judgment. We cannot chase the winds of public opinion." Crockett's tone turned almost solemn. "And yet, Chief Justice, the winds of public opinion often carry the scent of truth long before the courts recognize it. Slavery was once law. Segregation was once justified as order. History shows us restraint without empathy delays justice." Roberts was unmoved, at least outwardly. "History also shows us that when passion overpowers process, justice turns into vengeance. You ask this court to act with conscience, but conscience unmoored from structure leads to tyranny of emotion." Crockett nodded slightly. "Then perhaps the balance lies not in silencing conscience, but in giving it voice. The structure you defend so strongly should not be a cage that holds back justice, but a framework that guides it." For the first time, the Chief Justice hesitated, a flicker of something resembling introspection crossing his face. Crockett pressed on. "You said earlier that law is not passion. I agree, but neither is it apathy. It must breathe, evolve, and serve the living. Otherwise it becomes an artifact, cold, unfeeling, a relic worshipped more for its tradition than its truth." Roberts spoke after a moment, his tone quieter now. "You seek to redefine the court's role in moral terms, but morality is subjective. The law cannot afford subjectivity. Then let morality guide interpretation, not replace it," she said. "Because when the law loses its moral compass, it becomes a weapon, not a safeguard." The Chief Justice drew a slow breath. "And what you propose, would it not open the door for every judge to insert personal belief into rulings? Would it not fracture the very impartiality you demand?" She shook her head. "Not belief, Chief Justice, humanity. Judges are human. They bring understanding, empathy, perspective. Those are not weaknesses. They are the only things that make justice real." For a long moment he said nothing. The ticking clock filled the silence again. Then Roberts spoke, almost reluctantly. "Perhaps there is a point to be made about balance. But balance, Congresswoman, must still rest upon something solid, not sentiment, not anger." She replied softly, "Then let it rest upon truth. Because truth, even when uncomfortable, is the only thing solid enough to bear justice's weight." The Chief Justice looked down, his pen still in his hand but unmoving. He said, almost to himself, "Truth is a dangerous foundation. It shifts with perception. Only if we stop seeking it." She answered. The courtroom was utterly still. The words had ceased to sound like debate. They felt like confession. After a long silence, Roberts straightened again, his judicial composure returning. "Congresswoman Crockett, this court will recess for deliberation. When we return, you may present specific evidence supporting your claims of systemic bias. Until then, the court remains neutral." Crockett gave a slight nod. "Neutrality is the beginning of justice, Chief Justice, but not its end." He gave no reply. The gavel struck once more, the sound heavy as thunder. As the courtroom emptied, the storm outside had broken. Rain lashed against the windows, the steady, rhythmic sound of a world still struggling for balance between order and truth. Morning light crept through the high courtroom windows when the session resumed. The storm from the night before had left the city washed and pale, its echoes lingering in the air like unfinished thoughts. Inside the Supreme Court chamber, the tension was quieter now, but no less potent. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed forward. Chief Justice John Roberts sat still behind the bench, his expression composed yet heavy with contemplation. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett stood once more at the podium, a stack of documents resting before her. She didn't touch them. She didn't need to. The evidence by now was more than paper. The clerk called the session to order. The gavel struck once, and silence fell. Roberts began, his tone even but edged with fatigue. Congresswoman Crockett, this court has reviewed your submissions and heard your arguments. Before we proceed to deliberation, you may offer your closing statement. Crockett inclined her head slightly. Thank you, Chief Justice. She stepped forward. Her voice was clear, neither defiant nor pleading, but deliberate, like a truth that had waited too long to be said. Your Honors, I stand here not as a politician seeking victory, but as a citizen seeking fairness. What I've laid before you isn't an indictment of the judiciary itself, but a reflection of what happens when power becomes too comfortable with itself. She paused, letting her words settle. We've built a system meant to ensure equality, but somewhere along the line, equality turned conditional. Accountability became selective, and justice, the very thing this institution symbolizes, started serving those who already had the means to afford it. She turned slightly toward the gallery, where citizens, scholars, and journalists listened in silence. When the people lose trust in the courts, they don't just lose faith in judges, they lose faith in democracy. That is not a failure of politics. That is a failure of conscience. Her eyes shifted back to Roberts. You said yesterday that law requires restraint. I agree, but restraint must never mean silence in the face of wrong. Justice must be disciplined, yes, but also daring, because every major step forward in history came when someone dared to ask why. The Chief Justice's eyes met hers. And you believe this court has stopped asking why? She didn't hesitate. I believe it has stopped listening to those who do. There was no anger in her tone, only sorrow, a quiet disappointment that struck deeper than outrage. Crockett continued, This court's purpose is not to defend itself from criticism, but to defend the people from injustice. The robe does not grant immunity, it grants responsibility, and that responsibility is greatest when the truth is inconvenient. Roberts leaned forward, his voice lower now. You speak of truth as if it were absolute. But the truth, Congresswoman, is often divided, each side certain of its purity. Our duty is to find balance, not to pick sides. Crockett's reply came softly but with precision. Balance without courage is compromise, Chief Justice, and compromise in the face of injustice is surrender. A faint stir ran through the room. The Chief Justice folded his hands, thoughtful. He said, You've made compelling arguments. Yet, tell me, if the judiciary were to bend to public pressure, would that not destroy its integrity? The very independence that allows us to be impartial. Crockett shook her head. Independence doesn't mean isolation. Listening to the people isn't surrendering to them. It's acknowledging that law exists to serve them. Independence is not an excuse to forget empathy. She took a deep breath. The Constitution begins with we the people. It doesn't begin with we the powerful or we the court. That's the foundation. Everything else, every ruling, every precedent must answer to that promise. Her words echoed across the chamber unchallenged. The Chief Justice leaned back slightly, eyes thoughtful, expression unreadable. You make a passionate case for moral accountability. But if we transform courts into moral arenas, how do we guard against the tyranny of personal belief? How do we ensure that empathy doesn't replace evidence? Crockett met his gaze. By remembering that evidence without empathy is incomplete. Justice isn't blind. She's supposed to see clearly without bias. But when blindness becomes willful, when empathy is dismissed as weakness, then justice stops seeing at all. The silence that followed was long and uneasy. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some of the junior clerks exchanged glances. Even the marble pillars seemed to absorb the weight of the words. Finally, Roberts rose from his seat. The motion alone drew every eye toward him. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice firm again. "This court must operate within the confines of law. But you have reminded us that within those confines must also live humanity. The question now is not whether you are right or wrong, but whether this institution has forgotten what it exists to protect." He looked across the courtroom, not just at her, but at the other justices, the clerks, the audience. "This debate is not a trial, it is a mirror, and perhaps it reflects more than we intended to see." He paused, then continued, "Before the court delivers its findings, I will say this. The judiciary's strength lies not in being unquestioned, but in being willing to examine itself." Crockett's expression softened slightly. "Then, maybe today, Chief Justice, that examination has begun." Roberts nodded once, slowly. "Perhaps it has." The gavel struck gently, not as a command, but as a punctuation. "The court will recess for deliberation." He stood. The other justices followed. The audience rose instinctively, the hush of reverence washing through the chamber. As the bench withdrew, Roberts paused, turning back for a brief moment. His eyes met Crockett's again, a silent acknowledgment of respect, or perhaps recognition. Hours later, when the justices returned, the air was different. The atmosphere no longer carried the tension of conflict, but the weight of reflection. Roberts spoke first. His voice was solemn but clear. "After review of the presented materials and arguments, this court finds no evidence of deliberate judicial corruption. However," the pause was deliberate and every ear strained forward, "this court recognizes that perception of justice is as vital as justice itself. When the people's trust in their courts erodes, the fault lies not only in misunderstanding, but in the court's failure to communicate its conscience. Therefore, this court commits to greater transparency in its processes and decisions." A faint murmur spread through the gallery. It was not a ruling of guilt or innocence, but it was something more profound. It was acknowledgment. Roberts continued, his tone reflective. "Congresswoman Crockett, your challenge to this institution is not dismissed as defiance, but regarded as a reminder. Justice must not only be done, it must be felt. The integrity of law lies not in its distance from the people, but in its service to them." Crockett bowed her head slightly. "Then perhaps, Chief Justice, the system still works when it listens." Roberts allowed a faint, weary smile. "When it listens and when it learns." He lifted the gavel for the final time. "This court stands adjourned." The sound that followed was softer than thunder, but it carried just as far. As the chamber began to empty, Crockett gathered her papers slowly, her hands trembling only slightly. A young clerk approached and whispered, "Ma'am, you may not have won a ruling, but you changed something in there." Crockett smiled faintly. "That's all justice ever needed a beginning." Outside, the storm had cleared. Sunlight broke across the marble steps, casting long, golden reflections. Reporters rushed forward, microphones ready, but she said nothing. She simply looked up at the court's towering facade, a symbol now less distant, less untouchable, and walked down the steps with quiet resolve. Inside, Roberts remained seated a moment longer, gazing at the empty bench. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished wood, steady, thoughtful. He whispered softly to himself, "Perhaps the hardest truth is learning to listen." The echo of those words lingered, long after the hall had emptied, and somewhere beyond the marble pillars, the pulse of democracy, messy, fragile, and alive, continued on, carried by voices unafraid to question even the highest court in the land.